Hey, welcome. I'm Eric Scott, and this is What's My Line of Inquiry? Thinking like an Artist. So, I want to start off by kind of telling you my story, introducing myself a little bit, and give you some background about how this idea that I'm going to share with you about line of inquiry developed. My story is that I grew up in southwestern Pennsylvania. I always loved art. I have been making art for 45, almost 50 years now. And I grew up as loving art, making art, and then when I got into high school, I was like, oh, I want to share my love of art with other people, and so I got into teaching. So I'm a mixed media artist. I draw, paint, do all kinds of stuff, oftentimes mixing materials. But then I've also been an educator for 27 years now. This is my 27th year. 20 of those years were in public school. I started off in inner city Baltimore and then moved to Loudoun County, Virginia, where I taught 18 years. And then after that 18th year here, 20 years teaching, I stepped away from public school and kind of did my own thing. I ended up becoming the manager and an instructor at a local art center, the Round Hill Art Center, and then traveled and taught all over the country, did professional development for teachers, did different workshops and art retreats around the country. And here recently, this year, I actually went back into the classroom, went to a private school, the Loudon School for Advanced Studies. And it's a small private school in Ashburn, Virginia. It's middle and high school, but we only have a total of like 60 students. So my classes are really small, and I have two. I have a middle school class that has sixth, seventh, and eighth graders in it, and I have a high school class that has ninth, 10th, and 11th and 12th graders in it. So, I have very small classes. It's just a part-time job, but I'm really enjoying it because I can really take a lot of these ideas, uh, especially ones from this presentation, and use them in my teaching. So this this presentation came about because for probably the last 20 years or so, I've been teaching a choice-based curriculum, trying to get my students, to get my artists to think like artists, to come up with their own ideas. And it just really came about because at the beginning of my career, I was teaching projects. Every student made the same project, and what I really figured out was that it was my project. I came up with the idea. I solved all the problems. I'm the one that developed the whole thing. And actually, sometimes I get upset if the students didn't do it the way I had envisioned it and had planned it. And so I didn't really allow for a lot of originality or creativity, even though that was something that I said that I assessed for. But it really was not something that I assessed that much. So I got to the point where I'm like, I want my students to be artists, and I treat them like artists, and their ideas are more valid than mine. My ideas are valid for me, their ideas are valid for them. So I really wanted to help my students think like artists and to help them develop those original ideas. And so I've studied this. I've tried all kinds of things. I've done so many things over the years, but I landed on something that's a really simple concept that gives us a starting point. So this whole presentation is not going to lay out this elaborate thing and follow it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and voila, you have this amazing art curriculum. It's really about, here's a simple idea to help you plant seeds for your students to develop their own ideas, because it's a line of inquiry. And so a line of inquiry really is about, like, what is the artist interested in, what are the things that they want to do, and what kind of questions are they trying to answer with making their art. So um, I think that really their own experiences and the things that they're really into hold the key for developing original ideas that they are really into. So it's really more authentic, instead of just some superimposed big idea. So um, so this really came. This kind of started because of a podcast. So as a creator, as an educator, I'm always looking for ways to help my students be independent and have those creative thoughts and have those creative habits. And so I listen to a lot of podcasts. And one of the podcasts I listen to a lot is called The Creative Pep Talk by Andy J. Pizza. Now, Pizza is not his real name. Andy J. Miller is actually his name, but he goes by Pizza for the podcast. And in it, he talks a lot about taste. So his take is really trying to give people advice on, those that want to follow into a creative career. But he's always talking about, like, trying to find your style, trying to find your voice, trying to find a side project to really showcase and bring out your best. Often is about your taste. What are you into? What do you have a taste for? And um, he talks about it in a lot of different podcasts, but it's something that like really struck a chord with me. And for me, it made me think of that old saying, "You are what you eat." So you are what you eat. But I think if we look at it a slightly different way, change the word "eat" to "consume." You are what you consume, and thinking about what and I'm going to say we a lot because think about this for your own self, for your own art, because I think if you can go through this process yourself, then you can really help your students go through it. So for uh, yeah, so I've done this. I've gone through this myself, and I'm going to share an example of that later. But yeah, you are what you consume. So think about it for yourself, and then think about how you can use it with your students. So if we are what we consume, then we can we can really come up with ideas and come up with a line of inquiry based on the things that we have a taste for. So we can look at all these different things that we are consuming in a variety of ways, and maybe there are themes, ideas, patterns that start to emerge that give us that seed to start. So I'm giving you a starting point because every line starts with a point. And so this is a point for you, for your students to start. And this is kind of geared more toward secondary, and thinking about those of you that teach AP, this might be a good way to start getting your students to think about their sustained investigation. But I think the ideas can be really used at any level and can be modified at any level. But you are what you eat. So I think the problem, though, or the issue with a lot of young artists is that they are really caught up in spectacle, and so they really they're really drawn to art that is very well done, that's very eye catching, but maybe not for the right reasons. And so when I think about art and think about it for myself, or think about trying to teach somebody how to create art, I always think about these three things: the head, the hands, the heart. So we use our head to think, to plan. We use our hands actually to make, to do, to create. And we use our heart to think and to feel. Yeah, I think we think with our hearts. We lead with our hearts. We feel with our hearts. But the head, I really feel about like planning, hands, making, doing, creating. Heart, that's really the message, the meaning, the content, the concept that we want for the artwork. So yeah, your students oftentimes, though, are really concerned with just one of these, and it's usually the hands. They're usually about the technique and the material. So how do you use these to create this thing? And I think what happens is that leads to spectacle. And I've seen this a lot with student work. They get caught up. They learn how to do something like, oh, check this out, and so they get really good at a material, at a technique, and that's what the artwork is all about. So they get really caught up in it, and you see it everywhere. You see it on social media a lot. A lot of the big materials manufacturers and big art companies post these images of these like photorealistic sort of wow kind of things. So yeah, like they are awesome to look at. They're amazing. Like the technique and the skill involved to make that. Yeah, it makes me say wow. It shows that mastery. But for me, it's not much more, right? It that alone doesn't make for a great piece of art. Yeah, it's a step toward it, but if I just see a celebrity, or I see Voldemort, or I see some anime character, and it's like, okay, great, you can draw that really well, but why? Why are you doing this? So I think they get caught up in the how, and they don't get caught up in the why. And I think that goes back to the heads, hands, heart thing, is that the the heart really is the why. The hands are the how, and I think the head is part of the how. It's part of head, part of the how, and part of the why. But really thinking about the planning part of it, thinking through something. But the why. So I think a lot of young artists are not connected with that why part. So um, yeah. So how do you get students to develop their own original ideas? I mean, I've had students explore big ideas, and I mentioned that a little bit earlier, but sometimes I feel like it's just kind of a random thing. And so they don't personally connect to it. So, how do we get students to really personally connect with the art? Well, I think this idea is that if you are what you consume, you already have it in you, right? So again, going back to that idea of taste that Andy J. Pizza and the Creative Pep Talk podcast talks about. So yeah, what are we interested in? What are our students interested in? What intrigues them? What inspires them? And so um, for me, it's asking four very simple questions that can help us understand what our students are consuming, or what we are as artists are consuming, and can give us a starting point once we start to look at it. So yeah, so here are the questions. So you know start thinking about these for yourself, because again, I think if you think about it for yourself and you figure out how you want to um, do it, how you can do it, then you can take it back to your classroom and share it with your students. So, who are you looking at? Who are you listening to? Who are you watching? Who are you reading? So, there might be other ways that we consume things, maybe eating, but um, I don't know. But like thinking about artistically, thematically, these are the things that I think of whenever we talk about consuming. So, who are you looking at? So, in this day and age, our students and even ourselves should be looking at lots of art. I mean, it's so easy to see art nowadays. I always pull out the grumpy old man card with my students, and back in my day. So back in my day, we didn't have the internet. We didn't have computers in our pockets called cell phones, where we could constantly look up and have access to basically all of the information in the world at our fingertips. So if I wanted to look at art, I had to go to the library. I had to get out books. I had to look through a card catalog to find those books. And so it was really hard to find artists to look at. And when I did, oftentimes you'd only see one or two, and most often it was dead white guys. And in our contemporary culture, I mean, there's so many people out there making art, and we can see them, we can follow them on social media. So if we as artists, or if our students as artists aren't looking at other artists, they aren't looking at their social media feeds or Googling them. I mean, it's so easy to find images. So, you know, who are you looking at? Who are your students looking at? Who are the artists, the designers, those types of people that they can be looking at? Who are you listening to? So, thinking about the music, especially. I think mostly about music, because I think music, a lot of us, a lot of creatives, a lot of artists really connect with music, and we use it a lot. We listen to it when we create art. Sometimes it sets the mood, sometimes it inspires us. So who are we listening to? But it could also be podcasts, it could also be audiobooks. But who are you listening to? Who are your students listening to? Because again, that can hold the key. Maybe there are ideas or themes that come up in those things that you're listening to that you can use as the starting point. And the same thing with, who are you watching? What are the movies, the TV shows that you're watching? So maybe there's a favorite director or favorite actor or whatever, so that you think about like who are you watching and are there commonalities with those things? And then finally, who are you reading? So what are the books, the articles, the magazines, the newsletters, the blogs? Um, what are you reading? Because maybe there are some ideas there that could point us in the right direction. So when you do this for yourself or you do this with students, I would think about limiting the yourself. So limit it to like the top three or five, four or five. I wouldn't do a big list because I think the bigger the list is, the more diverse it's going to be, and maybe the harder it is to see patterns and themes emerge from it. It'll seem a little bit here, there, and everywhere. So your top three, four, or five could be a good way to really start to discern those patterns, because what you do then is you have your list of your top three artists you're looking at. And think about like going back to even your childhood, going back to things. So, sometimes the things that we watched as kids still resonate with us and still are some of our favorite things. So it doesn't have to be who are we looking at right now, who are we listening to, or who are we watching or reading right at this moment, but of all time, who are our all-time favorites, our top three, four, or five, and you then go back in and you look at it. So maybe there are artists that you're looking at, and you look at them and maybe take and pick out three or four pieces from each of these artists and put it in a file, or print them out and glue them into your sketchbook and look at them, because you might all of a sudden realize like, oh, wait a minute, all of these artists are using this color scheme, or they all have this subject in common, and I didn't really realize that until I put them down on paper or saw them in a single document. Or maybe there are ideas that these artists are all exploring that are very similar. And so that's a key. That's a starting point. That could be where a line of inquiry starts. Like, oh, I like that color scheme. That could be the beginning of something. And you do that with each of these. So who are you listening to? Who are you watching? Who are you reading? And that idea of like music. So maybe there's a certain genre of music that your top three, four, or five folks are in, and all of a sudden you're like, oh, okay, yeah, there's this genre, but they're all speaking about this thing. Or maybe there's there's some themes or ideas that keep coming up in that music. Um, and again, do that with the movies, the TV shows, the books that you're reading. So as you start to list those top three, four, or five, start to look at the commonalities that they have. And so if you can print out pictures and make it more visual and maybe cut them out and put them in a journal or make a document, it might help you, it might help your students to really start to physically see those connections. And you might not really realize that there is something in common with all of these. All of a sudden you might start to see like, oh, wait a minute, I'm looking at artists that explore this idea, this concept. I'm listening to music, and they're singing and playing music about the same thing, and I'm watching all these movies that do the same. And then I'm reading all this stuff, and it's all connected because, oh, all of a sudden you realize like, oh, I'm really into like post-apocalyptic kind of things, or I'm really into the hero's journey, or I'm really into very bright, very happy kind of things. And that could become that place to start, because you start to realize like, oh, this is my taste. These are the things that inspire me. These are the things I'm interested in. So, like I was saying, this is really just a starting point. It's not about one, two, three, four, five, six, and here you are all making this great art. It's about here's a place to start, and trying. What I do next is try to give the students possibilities. Like, where do you go from here? Okay, because every artist is different. So, all right, so you have this idea. Maybe a theme came up. So where do you take this? So for some students, they're going to get a very specific image in mind. They're going to be like, oh, I'm going to make this thing. And instead of, oh, go grab a big canvas, why don't you grab 3, 4, 5 little pieces of paper and make 5 different versions of this and spend 5, 10 minutes on each one? and experiment and play and see if this is really something that you want to do. Or maybe you want to do some thumbnail sketches in your sketchbook and work out your composition and do some writing about it. So that's another thing. Like maybe you want to do some free writing or some stream of consciousness writing and develop that idea even more. So yeah, so think about like, do you start experimenting and playing around with stuff? Do you do some sketching in your journal, your sketchbook? Do you do some writing about it? Do you make a journal page about that topic, that theme, that idea? And so, yeah, I mean, again, I'm not giving you all the steps. I'm just saying, like, okay, this is the seed, this is the starting point, and now the artist is the gardener. They have to tend that garden. Where do you take that idea, and where does it go from there? And that's where the line of inquiry comes from, right? That okay, I have this idea, so what's my question? So turning that into a question, it might be like, oh, okay, I really like the hero's journey. Okay, so how do you turn that into a question? Okay, well, how can I create artwork that helps tell the story based on the hero's journey? Like, okay, there's a question. So now how do I make that art? Sometimes it might be like, oh, I really like these colors. So how can I use these colors in a piece of artwork to help convey this feeling that I get when I see them? Or sometimes it might just be like, how do I make that thing? And that could become the part of it. And so now is when I want to share with you kind of my own line of inquiry. And it has to do with my monsters. So if you're familiar with me on social media or anything, you might know that I do a lot of monsters. I draw, I paint, I collage, I make these different monsters. But about 7 years ago, I started doing them because I was teaching. It was my last year in public school. I was teaching elementary school, and one of my fourth graders was doing it, and I was like, oh, that looks like a lot of fun. And it was at the beginning of the year, like in the fall, and right before Halloween, and so monsters were everywhere. They were on the tissue boxes and all over TV and this and that. And I just thought like that looks really fun. I want to do that. And so my first line of inquiry, my first question was, how do I draw a monster? Like I haven't drawn monsters since I was a little kid. So how do I draw monsters? And I had to figure that out. And so that was like the first thing I had to do. And I ended up looking at like monsters, just like Googled like cute, grumpy monsters because I don't want to do scary monsters. So I Googled and looked at like these different monsters and got an idea. Started finding artists that did monsters, and I started doing some sketches. And then I kind of once I did some sketches, I was like, oh, I like this little guy, and I took this monster and I made it, and that's what you see, this red monster with the wings. And this was my first monster that I created an actual work of art from, and it was only a 4 by 6 inch piece, so I didn't do anything big. It was just sort of like, okay, I've been sketching these monsters, now I want to paint them. And so I started by painting them. But what's interesting is that this is like my first like official monster, first work of art of a monster. Had done a bunch of sketches beforehand to kind of start to work things out, but my style has changed so much. And so this monster is really much more indicative of my style. And so that was the thing, was like, okay, I'm learning how to do monsters. So how do I come up with my style? So like how do I come up with my monsters? And so I started looking at all these artists. I started finding these artists that do monsters, just Googling it. So who am I looking at? I'm looking at these other artists that are making monsters and figuring out how they're doing it. But the thing is that as I was doing this, it was about technique. It was about, I would draw them or paint them or collage them or started doing 3D. So when I started doing model magic with my elementary school students, I thought, oh, the model magic monster is a couple inches high. I thought that'd be perfect. Like, but what if it's more permanent? And I thought of polymer clay. And so I started exploring polymer clay. Like, how can I make these monsters out of polymer clay? And I looked at it, even more artists online who worked in clay, and I figured out how to do it. It was a big learning curve because I'd never used polymer clay before. And so I had to figure all this stuff out about baking it and all this stuff. And I did a whole bunch of these little polymer clay monsters, and that led into doing actual ceramic monsters. I was teaching some summer camps and some workshops for Girl Scouts doing clay, showing how to do pinch pots, and then like, oh, what if I turn these pinch pots into monsters? And again, just I really like monsters. How can I make a pinch pot into a monster? It's a very simple inquiry. But what happened was over time, and this was actually over years and years, it became like I just was feeling like, okay, there's got to be more. Like, how can I use these monsters to convey some kind of emotion or some kind of feeling? And so that kind of came up, and I was like, oh, there's my line of inquiry. So I took these monsters and I made pieces like this. I made a whole series of monsters that were in like more of a scene. The background was a simple mixed media background, but trying to play around with you know, having the monsters do something. So this monster is holding a balloon, a heart-shaped balloon. And I really think of it as exploring that idea of caring, of compassion, of giving your heart away. Also thinking about the fragile nature of a balloon and maybe the fragile nature of your heart. And when you give your heart away, sometimes it gets broken, it gets busted. So, you know, trying to play around like, can I convey some kind of message, some kind of meaning with this? And what I realized though is that during all of this, you know, this was years and years of doing this, and I know students don't have years and years, but you know, you can share this with students and explain that like these ideas change, and that inquiry actually over time will change and help you get deeper and deeper with it. And so what I realized was like, oh, okay, why am I creating these monsters? Well, because they're me. Like that was a simple revelation that just kind of popped into my head one day after making these was like, well, these monsters really are about me. And if every work of art is a self-portrait, then yeah, these monsters are me. And I was thinking about that idea of inner demons, and demons just sounds a little too nasty and too mean and maybe too scary. Um, I started thinking about monsters and like what would my inner monsters look like? Because my monsters were always grumpy looking, confused looking, anxious looking. They weren't happy. They weren't like little cute little monsters roaming around and skipping around and all that stuff. They were just sort of like mean and grumpy. And I realized like, well, that's because I feel that way so much of the time. I feel grumpy. I feel confused. I feel anxious. And so I did a whole series, 10 in total, that I call Inner Monsters. And so I took these monsters and I started thinking about how can I give them expressions, you know, like the look that I give my students whenever they do something where I'm just like, what in the world are you doing? Or how I feel, you know, when something interrupts my routines, you know, like just those little things, like nothing mean, nothing nasty, but you know, like the feeling that I get whenever I'm upset on the road, I get a little bit of road rage, you know. So I did a whole series of these, and you know, they're not the most exciting composition, but the theme, the idea, the concept behind them, though, got a lot deeper and a lot more personal. And so, yeah, we could do that with our students. Like, okay, you started off with this idea, this notion, because of the things that you were interested in, and then you develop that. That's your line of inquiry. And for me, the monsters, though, I mean, it might seem I kind of presented it in a way where it's like kind of came out of nowhere. I saw this girl, one of my fourth graders do it, like, oh, I'm going to do it. However, thinking about what I consume, and especially what I consumed as a kid, it wasn't, I'm not surprised that monsters came up because, and that as an adult, that I'd start drawing monsters because of people like Marie Sendak and Where the Wild Things Are. My favorite book as a kid. And, you know, I even used this book in my teaching early on whenever I was teaching elementary school. And I love that book. I still love that book. It's one of my all time favorites. Love the story, love the wild things that are in it. I know they're not technically monsters, but, you know, I think they are. I think they are monsters. They're wild things. Seeing stuff like that, and like, oh, that was something I connected to as a kid. But then also thinking about Jim Henson and the Muppets and the monsters, like the Muppet monsters, they weren't super scary. They might have big teeth and but there's something about they're kind of fuzzy and cute and round, and you got Oscar the Grouch, and sometimes they're not the happiest monsters, um, but I really connected. I mean, I grew up in the 70s and the 80s, and so I watched the Muppet Show. I grew up with Sesame Street, Cookie Monster and Harry Monster. They were teaching me to read and to write and to count, and yeah, it's like so connected to my childhood. So these were things that I consumed as a kid, and I mean, I recently rewatched the Muppet shows on Disney Plus and watched Fraggle Rock. So I go back and still watch those things and consume those things. So they're constant. So I didn't set out like when I started Monsters like, oh, this is like Jim Henson, but it really did connect. Like I found that connection. So the ideas that I'm sharing with you is a way to kind of start that idea first with thinking about what are you or your students consuming? What are they looking at? What are they watching? What are they listening to? What are they reading? And are there ideas, subjects, themes, um, things that they want to investigate, things that they want to try, things that they're interested in, things that they're inspired by? So, what are those things that they are consuming, and how can that be the starting point to move forward? So, you are what you consume. So, what are you consuming, and how can that help you make your art? What are your students consuming, and how can that help them create art that has meaning to them, that's personally connected to them, and not just something that the teacher has given them to do? So, anyway, yeah, like I said, this was just really about being a starting point and not laying out a roadmap of how to do this thing. It's just like, here are these 4 questions, and take them back to your classroom, take them back to your own artwork, even, and think about how you and your students can use them to figure out their tastes, the things that they are interested in, the things that they are inspired by, and that can be the starting point for a line of inquiry, because that's what artists do. Oh, I have this thing I'm interested in, I'm inspired by this. How do I do this? How do I make that? How do I take this up a notch? How do I figure out what I want to say with my art? That's what the inquiry is all about. So, anyway, I appreciate you tuning in, and I hope you got something out of it. And like I said, try to take those 4 questions back to your classroom and see how they can help you. So, I'm on social media, so at Scott Art on any social media platforms, and then of course, I have a website, so check me out there. But anyway, please, if you have any questions or comments, post them into the comments, and I'll try to get back and respond to anything. But yeah, if you have specific questions or comments, please post them. And I appreciate you being here. Appreciate you tuning in. And like I said, I hope you got something out of it. And until next time, until next year, happy creating.